Hi there, Allison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we are in the North Fork of Long Island AVA of New York State, and we're looking at the Bedell Cellars 2019 Cabernet Franc. Bedell Cellars is one of Long Island's pioneering wineries. Kip and Susan Bedell planted their first vines at the estate back in 1980. And by the early 1990s, the winery was already garnering attention and accolades for its wines. Bedell Cellars has been in the loving hands of the Lynne family since it was purchased by Michael and Ninah Lynne back in the year 2000. Their winemaker, Olsen-Harbich, has been with the winery since 2010. And with over 40 vintages under his belt, and the person who authored the Federal American Viticultural Area applications for the North Fork of Long Island, the Hamptons, Long Island, and the Long Island AVAs, one could argue that if there is anyone that is deserving of the title Father of Long Island Wine, Olsen-Harbich would indeed be that person. Now, I have done a few videos featuring wines from the Finger Lakes, but I have not yet done a video featuring a Cabernet Franc from Long Island. So I thought that it would be the perfect opportunity to look at the Cabernet Franc picture in New York State, as this is a very important grape variety here. So Cabernet Franc is the fourth most planted vitis vinifera variety overall, and the second most planted red vinifera variety after Merlot. And the acreage is currently sitting at around 495 acres. That's about 200 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines planted in the state. And the plantings are almost evenly split between the Finger Lakes and Long Island. Finger Lakes has currently around 236 acres planted, and Long Island around 215 acres at last count. Located on the northeast coast of the United States and stretching about 115 miles or about 180 kilometers from Brooklyn in the west to the village of Montauk in the east, Long Island is essentially a low-lying peninsula, and it's surrounded by three major bodies of water. We have the Atlantic Ocean in the south, the Long Island Sound in the north, and the Great Peconic Bay in the east, which divides the peninsula's north and south forks. The main viticultural activity takes place in the eastern part of Long Island, and Long Island is comprised of three American viticultural areas. We have the Hamptons Long Island AVA, which was set up in 1985. This covers the South Fork of Long Island. And then we have the North Fork of Long Island AVA, which was established in 1986. And then we have the Long Island AVA, which covers the entire peninsula, and this was set up in 2001, excuse me. So these bodies of water and the relatively low elevation that we find here on Long Island, that means that these bodies of water have a big influence on the growing environment here. And even though we are at a lower latitude, about 41 degrees north latitude, which is similar to that of northern Portugal, the climate of Long Island can be characterized as cool maritime. So these bodies of water help to temper the rather harsh winters that are experienced in the northeast part of North America, but they also help to moderate and cool the warmer daytime temperatures that the region experiences during the summer months. These bodies of water also help to delay bud break in the springtime, and they also help to extend the growing season in the fall. And this gives Long Island, in general, a relatively gentle, long, moderate growing season. Bedell Cellars and its vineyards are located on the North Fork of Long Island, and there's some key elements that contribute to the unique growing conditions that we find here. So the North Fork starts around 65 miles, or so about 105 kilometers east of New York City, and it stretches around 30 miles or 45 kilometers to the northeast. And this is a relatively narrow peninsula, and it's about 6 miles wide or 10 kilometers wide at its widest point, and about 2 miles or 3 kilometers or so wide at its narrowest point. And we're at a relatively low elevation, only about 6 to 20 meters above sea level. And to the north, we find the Long Island Sound, and to the south, we have the Great Peconic Bay, which is what separates the north from the South Fork. And while the influence of the Atlantic Ocean is still quite evident here, it is actually a little bit less on the North Fork than it is on the South Fork, because the South Fork kind of buffers a little bit of that Atlantic influence. So the North Fork of Long Island is a little bit warmer, and the growing season here is actually a little bit longer as well, about 233 days total, which means that the North Fork of Long Island AVA has the longest growing season of any AVA in New York State, which is great for a later ripening variety like Cabernet Franc. So the summertime temperatures are rather warm, but they're tempered by these constant cooling breezes that come in off the Atlantic Ocean. And the region experiences a moderate amount of precipitation, about 1,000 millimeters of precipitation annually, and this falls mostly in the winter months. The fall temperatures are cooled gradually, and there's very little risk of frost in October and into November. And this is a bit different than what we find in the interior regions like the Finger Lakes, which has a bit more of a continental climate, and they tend to see more larger temperature swings, particularly in the fall. So Long Island will have, or excuse me, the North Fork will have in particular this very long hang time for varieties like Cabernet Franc, which is super beneficial. And because of this gradual cooling, this helps to preserve acidities. It also helps for a gradual ripening of the sugars and phenolics as well, leading up to harvest. In terms of soils on Long Island, these soils are of glacial origin, and they were formed after the last ice age about 11,000 years ago. And there are two broad groups of soils that we find here on Long Island. We have sandy loams and silt loams. And these soils are the top soils, and then we have the subsoils underneath, which are a combination of sands and gravels. And these sandy loams and silt loams are well-draining soils. They're very deep, and they have low to moderate fertility, and they have moderate water holding capacity as well. And in the center of Long Island, we tend to find slightly heavier soils. And then as you move closer to the coast, to the bodies of water, the soils get a little bit lighter and sandier in texture. Now on the North Fork in particular, we find two main soil series here. We have the Carver, Plymouth, Riverhead soils. These are sandy loam soils. And then we have the Haven Riverhead soils, and these are silt loam soils, or predominantly loam soils. And these soils in general are slightly lighter in texture, and they contain less silt and less loam than the soils that we find on the South Fork. And in terms of Bedell Cellars and their vineyards, they have around 75 acres in total. That's about 30 hectares. And they're planted across, their vines are planted across 3 different vineyard sites on the North Fork of Long Island. They currently have around 12.5 acres of Cabernet Franc vines planted. That's about 5 hectares or so. And along with their single varietal Cabernet Franc, the grape makes its way into a few other wines. And in recent years, they've actually been doing in small quantities a white Cabernet Franc done in a still Blanc de Noir style, which is kind of interesting. For this 2019 vintage Cabernet Franc, this is coming from around 2.5 hectares, or about 6 acres of Cabernet Franc vines. And these vines are specifically in their Cord Creek vineyard, which is about 2 miles east of the winery. It's on a southern exposure at about 11 meters above sea level. And the vines were planted between 1996 and 2015. And the soil that we find here is that Haven loam. But Rich did mention to me that the Haven loam in the Quarry Creek site is actually a little bit lighter and sandier in texture. And this actually gives grapes that are some of their best and most complex of all the Cabernet Franc blocks that they have at the estate. So from a winemaking perspective, this is very traditional winemaking here. The fruit was all hand harvested, hand sorted. It was destemmed, lightly crushed as well. And the fruit was transferred via gravity into open top stainless steel tanks. And the fruit undergoes a 24-hour cold soak in advance of alcoholic fermentation. And the alcoholic fermentation is done with indigenous yeast. And Rich will go in and do some pump overs, about 10 he said, during the active fermentation. And the total time on skins is around 21 days in total. And then the aging takes place in a combination of neutral French oak barrels as well as neutral upright, larger French oak vats. And then the aging, total aging time is around 10 or so months. So let's get into this wine. So the wine has a really lovely nose, and the fruits lean in that sweet, tart, savory spectrum, but they are indeed red. I'm getting a lot of red fruits here. And it's a mix of, I would say, there's some raspberry here, there's a touch of cherry as well, there's a little bit of like a foresty berry thing going on. And I like the balance of the fruit and the pyrazines. Pyrazines are coming through at a moderate level, and I'm getting a nice mix here. There's a little bit of an herbal undertone like thyme. There's a touch of cedar here as well. There's a smidge of like a capsicum thing happening, but it's coming through for me as like paprika spice. And there is a little bit of a floral note on the nose as well, which is quite pretty. On the palate, those same bright red fruits come through really nicely. They are on the sweeter side. There's a little bit of a savory, foresty, wild edge to the fruits, which is quite nice. There's a little bit of like a pomegranate tart, snappy thing on the palate as well, which is really nice. It's providing a nice counterpoint to the sweeter fruits. The herbal undertones come through bang on as they did. This wine is really spicy on the palate, which I love. I love when Cabernet Franc has that kind of spicy energy to it. I'm getting a bit of that paprika thing happening. There's a touch of clove here as well. Actually, on the palate as well, there's some additional layers that are coming through now. Touch of cocoa. There's a little bit of a cured tobacco thing as well on the palate. In terms of the acidity is really vibrant, mouth-watering, quite succulent, and there's a nice balance of the acidity and the weight and the composure of the fruit, if you will. Now, in terms of the tannins, for me, the tannins are very distinctive. And I wrote down that they come through a bit gauzy and feathery, as if they have this broader weave to them. At least in the mouth, there's a broadness to how this wine sits on the palate. And on the finish, though, it's a little bit different. So the finish, the tannins are firm. There's a tautness, there's a velvetiness to the finish as well. And that difference, that kind of counterpoint in terms of the tannins, how they feel in the mouth and the texture and this openness to the mouth versus how they kind of finish with a bit more of a direct punch, that's good. That's providing this wine a nice backbone. That in combination with the acidity is giving this wine some really nice structure. This wine has a medium weight. There's a lot of layers here. This wine clocks in at 12.5 alcohol. And it really does pack a punch. There's a lot of layers, there's good concentration, there's a nice fruit core to the middle palate as well. And it's just a really gorgeous, serious, well-intentioned expression of Cabernet Franc. And I admit that when I was tasting this earlier, I noted like if I was tasting this blind, I wouldn't have been able to peg where this wine is coming from. And that is my inexperience talking, because I will admit that this is my first Long Island Cabernet Franc. So I'm unfamiliar with the expressions of Cabernet Franc from this particular part of New York. But I sensed instantly that this was not Finger Lakes, this was not Niagara, this was not Loire, it was its own thing. And that, I think, is really special, because it shows me that the winemaker understands the grape variety, understands the terroirs, and is trying to communicate the vineyard and communicate the place as best as he can in the glass. And I hope, and I'm sure that there will be much more examples of Cabernet Franc from Long Island coming my way in the future. And I hope over time that as I taste more and experience more, that I will be able to hone in on what Cabernet Franc from Long Island is in terms of an expression, because I do think that there is something really special about this grape and place combination. If you have had the Bedell Cellars Cabernet Franc, or if you have another favorite Cabernet Franc from another producer on Long Island, please do let me know who the producer is in the comments below. I am super keen to discover more producers here. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.